Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave, and we'd love to know where you agree with us and where you vehemently disagree with us, which you can do by visiting unsilentpodcast.com. There's a great comments section over on Rumble and a whole variety of social media channels. Well, good afternoon, Brian. What do you think's interesting in the news? Or it's actually kind of boring these days, isn't it? There's really not much going on.
Yeah. Yeah, the torrid pace continues. And for those listening in 2025, Dave and I are recording this about a week and a half before the episode's going to air due to some travel I have. So if we missed something super big and you're wondering what the heck are these guys talking about this for instead, that's why. So the first thing sometimes things just happen that I find humorous. Now I understand I have kind of a twisted sense of humor, so some folks might not find this as funny as I do. But I'm looking at a clip of and I don't need to share it because it's pretty self-explanatory. But there's a Democrat congresswoman who is claiming that the reason we don't have more women in manufacturing is because man is part of the word manufacturing and therefore is exclusionary.
Seriously, no, you're looking at the Babylon Bee. No,
I'll share it if you want, but it's
okay. This just reminds me of that. This is a lawmaker. You're telling me this is a
yeah. In fact,
sort of
I'll tell you what.
Yes, let's share it. Share it. I got to see this. This is just wonk. It's weird.
Give me 1 second here to get my screen ready where I can.
As you're doing that, this reminds me. You remember that hearing was a number of years ago where one of the senators or Congress people was quizzing somebody about building a base on an island, and they were concerned that the island would capsize.
Dave, you read my mind. Hank Thompson was worried that the island of Guam would capsize because of having too many people and too much weight on one side of the island. And you stole my punchline. I was going to say this is one of the dumber things I've heard since Hank Thomas worried about an island tipping over.
Tip over.
Great minds think alike, I guess, yeah, right? So let me get to my screen here where I can share this. And
all right, let's take a look at
here we go.
In getting young people. Yesterday, I met with a manufacturing company, but they also are engaged in getting young people more engaged in manufacturing. So I asked them, so how many of those students that are signing up and want to do this, how many are women? And they said, well, I know there's at least 13% or something. It was a low number. And you had mentioned trying to engage more women in manufacturing. I'm just wondering if just the name manufacturing sounds like a guy.
I don't know what to say. I mean, these people actually get into office. I wonder if there's any kind of, sentient test that we can be applied to Congress people before they apply for running for office. That's just insane.
I agree. But the thing that shocks me the most about that Hank Thompson thing is he was reelected after that multiple times.
Yeah.
That happened like 8-10 years ago, and he's been elected, 3 or 4 times since then.
Well, and if that is not an indication that the entire structure is set up on tribes, on my team and your team, it's like, I don't care if my guy's an idiot, he's better than your guy who can fog a mirror. I mean, so it's just staggering that folks with that level of cognitive decline can be.
Well, in her defense now, but think about if you somehow could make your living, Dave, on reorganizing the language, that's a never-ending project.
Oh, of course it is.
I mean, like it's if you can get true buy-in to that, like that's lifetime job security. I mean, George Carlin did a whole bit about this, about when they they take it too far because they want us to call it the people hole cover, not a manhole cover.
Yeah, that's right.
And what's a ladies' man going to be? A people's people? You know, I mean, he did a whole bit on this 30 years ago. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
But if you're in the business where you make your income by constantly evolving the language, like that's a never ending gig. Like you couldn't have better job security.
It's a great gig. It's a great gig. All you have to do is disconnect your brain, and you're good to go.
Yeah. So the other thing that this is not as funny, but it does kind of also highlight this kind of behavior that, again, Dave, for those listening, Dave and I are talking to somebody like 70 years in the future, as they're no doubt going to look back at this period of time we've gone through or going through and wonder what the heck was wrong with these people? What were they thinking? And Dave and I are trying to cover things that won't be in the history books. Like what does it feel like to be in this moment? What are the things that are going to be lost in history? And I saw this thing. This is from the University of this is from the University of Colorado Boulder. The author is named Jennifer Ho. And here's just the headline and the byline. So I'm not going to read the whole article, but here's the headline and the byline. The headline is "White supremacy is the root of all race-related violence in the U.S." And then the byline is, "The point I've made through all those experiences that anti-Asian racism has the same source as anti-Black racism, white supremacy. So when a Black person attacks an Asian person, the encounter is fueled perhaps by racism, but very specifically by white supremacy. White supremacy does not require a white person to perpetuate it."
Okay, then. Okay. Well, there's probably some kind of logical thought pattern involved in that. Maybe. I don't know.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's again, I don't like these. We live in an era right now where everything is compared to Nazi Germany, right? And even I do that. I talk about,
sure.
I don't talk about like, I talk about what it feels like the shifting of the government and the structure and things like that for the ordinary citizens who had to live through that horrible time.
Right.
But if you look at like people or generations or societies that are able to and willing to find a tribe that they can focus all their angst and hatred and anger and resentment for life not going as well as we want collectively and individually and all this stuff. If you can find an acceptable target for that stuff, well, why not just blame everything on them?
Yeah.
And this isn't all that much different than what we saw in 1930s Germany, where they had a class of people defined by some immutable characteristics that they were the cause of all problems, and we have a similar one today. And I would argue it's not that different than how people thought in 1940s Mississippi or 1850 Georgia or whatever. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon, is my point.
No.
But every generation who does this can't see that they're doing it. There's always, you have talked about this before a million times. There's always a justifiable reason that makes it okay in our case. Yeah, it was bad for those people, but in our case, it's different. You don't understand.
Well, I think the basis of that is you make a conclusion, and I think I've talked about this before. There's system one thinking and system two thinking. System one thinking is automatic. It's when we cross the street. It's when we brush our teeth. We don't have to think I need an up and down motion and I need to go and I need to. It's just automatic, right? And there's system two thinking where we consider all of the parameters. And when you learn to drive, you start off with system two thinking. You have to analyze everything. Okay, now I'm going to turn the turn signal because I'm so you think through everything. Later on, driving is system one, it's just automatic. So I think what happens with people in terms of how they apply that, or how that applies, how that, sort of neurological process applies to things like this, is you come to a conclusion. So you think through it at some point, and you might use a few facts. You might use some level of facts. And this person obviously thought, okay, well, colonialism equals white people equals racism, so that's bad. Now, anything that comes up, so that's now moved from system two to system one thinking. Now, from now on, anything that has to do with racism is automatically white supremacy and colonialism because there's no thinking that takes place. Once you're in a reflexive, once you're in a reflexive mode, reflexive mentality, and you just respond out of preconditioned ideas you've got, you don't have to be logical anymore. You don't have to think through it. You don't have to compare that and say, well, if there's no white people involved, how can it be white? How can it be white supremacy? How's that makes it sense? Sense doesn't come into it at that point. It's just instinct at that point. And that's why we have these things. And that's why it makes good comedy too, because it's so insane.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I grew up in areas where, we lived pretty regularly on the wrong side of the tracks, you might say. And so I was regularly around people of different races and things like that.
Sure.
And I can tell you from personal experience that hating another race is not specifically a white people problem.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely right. That's again, it's a human thing. We
Yeah.
those things that are different than us, those people that are different than us, we naturally gravitate towards people that are like us. It's just,
Yeah.
and that's not there. There's no evil in that. It's just kind of how people are. I mean, dogs mostly hang out with dogs, cats mostly hang out with cats. It's just kind of how like attract, and so therefore there's a slide or a risk that's potential to say, well, I'm going to hang out with my own, and the others are dangerous. The others that are not me or not my type are dangerous.
Yeah. And when I was saying earlier, like I grew up on the wrong side of tracks, I don't mean like I lived in a bad area because of race. I lived around poor people, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there was, so it's interesting to me to see that rich people still have this just as much as, growing up not knowing any better. It's like, okay, well, this is how poor people think, but then rich people don't think like this. So here's somebody who's writing for a university
Sure.
publication of some sort, what I would have considered as a 12-year-old kid to be somebody who's got an elite status, for them to be having that same kind of thing. It's kind of bizarre.
Well, it does go also, Brian, to the thing, a base principle that we've applied throughout this entire podcast since we started, and that is that human nature is relatively unchangeable, relatively immutable. We work really hard to overcome the more base parts of our nature, but human nature applies whether you're rich, whether you're poor, whether you're from Asia, Africa, Europe. It doesn't really matter. Human nature is going to apply, and to deny that or to think that we can put enough structures of bureaucracy and government and social structure into place that it completely overcomes that is not possible. We can put enough in place to help mitigate that. We put laws in place for one reason, and that is to overcome human nature. We put institutions in place so that we can nurture the better parts and suppress the bad parts. But even then, they get infected again with human nature. It's all back to that.
Right. I mean, you look at like India; they have the I don't know what version they have now, the caste system, but
yes,
they weren't separated by race; they were separated by economic status.
Yeah.
But you couldn't move from one caste level to the next caste level. They didn't allow that. You look at the Hutsis and Tutsis, or Houthis and Hutus and Tutsis, I think is what they. Again, not by race, but by some other kind of characteristic that it became socially acceptable to call them bad, and therefore they were, and they, I don't know how many, it was like 1 million people died, and with machetes and stuff like that. It was crazy. Like it's just interesting to me that the perpetrators always have justification, and therefore they are absolved of any. They can't see that this behavior is bad because they have the proper justification that's necessary to absolve them of any guilt. And I find that super fascinating. Just looking, not even in a distant history, like 30 years ago. That thing in the Tutsis and Hutus or whatever. That was in the 90s, I think. I mean, that's not that long ago.
Well, I think I don't know if I've told this story on the cast before, but there was a couple of years when I traveled in Southern Europe and then in Northern Europe. And I know I've told the story about Southern Europe. When I was in Southern Europe, is in visiting Macedonia, but it's worth repeating. I was visiting Macedonia, which is just north of Greece. And when we pulled into going back to Athens from Macedonia, we pulled into a rest stop in northern Greece, and near Thessaloniki. And we pulled past a parking spot opened up in front of us. We pulled into it, and and then the car that was in front of us jammed in reverse, slammed back into right behind us, and came out. And these three big Greek guys came out and said, "Is this the way you drive in your country?" And they were about ready to start swinging. Now, my friend and I walked next to my friend. We didn't get into a fight, but he said, "Go back to your country." Now, the interesting thing, a couple of different things about that. The Greeks and the Macedonians, they don't really look that much different. I mean, judge a book by its cover, they kind of all look pretty much the same. Now, I'd be insulting people, I suppose, to say that, but we asked a friend in Athens. I said, "What happened here?" And he said, "Well, it's just anti-Macedonian sentiment because the Macedonians believe that Alexander the Great was born in their part of the world, and Macedonia is an ancient name. In fact, they even had to change the name of Macedonia to the Republic of North Macedonia to make the Greeks happy. So it was just this Hatfields and McCoys." Now, fast forward a year, I'm in the Baltic states. I'm in right next to Russia, and I'm in Russia as well. And in the Baltic states, of course, they were dominated by Russia during the Soviet era. And so there's about 40% of most of those countries, of those three small countries, are Russian speaking people. Now, the Russian speaking people there feel that they're an oppressed minority because the native born Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians are mad at them still because, hey, you guys invaded our country. And so you've got both of these sides have legitimate gripes against, quote unquote, legitimate gripes against the other ones. So it doesn't matter where you go in the world, everybody's mad at their neighbor for some perceived slight or for something that they can't forgive them. What would happen in the Middle East, Brian? This is a thought experiment I ran like as a teenager because I'm like, why are all these people mad at each other all the time in the Middle East? I couldn't understand it. It's like, what if mass amnesia came over the entire Middle East, and a lot of these people, they all kind of look similar. I don't know, man, I'm probably getting in all sorts of trouble now. But they look kind of similar. Would they all be so mad at each other anymore? So wherever you go, people will not forgive their neighbor. They for having such a horrible belief as Alexander the Great was born in my country, not yours, 25 centuries ago. This again, it's back to that human nature thing we were talking about just a few minutes ago. We have to, and it also goes to the human nature point that we like to think of ourselves as exalted above other people because we're too aware of our own our own problems but their problems are so much bigger than mine.
So why would they fight over which country Alexander the Great lived in? Well, it's because it gives them status.
It gives them status.
Our people spawned Alexander the Great, arguably the greatest military mind of all time, and arguably the greatest conqueror of all time. Therefore, I have some of that in me, and therefore I have a higher level of status or ability or whatever. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And that almost got me punched in the face in a northern Grecian rest stop. So there you go. That's how it plays out.
So to answer your question, what would happen if you gave the entire Middle East amnesia and you did the Men in Black thing and wand and and poof, they lost their memory of why they hated other people. My guess is it would take about 25 years for something to reemerge.
I'm sure. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. That is the principle. The principle is that human nature is relatively immutable.
It would take roughly one generation.
Yeah. No, you're right. That's exactly. In fact, that's guaranteed. That's exactly what would happen. No.
Yeah. So the next thing that I get something. This stuff is comical. I mean, it's both comical and sad and maddening as hell, right? But I'm looking at this is a post that came out a couple days ago from Elon Musk, and it shows the buckets of ages that people are collecting Social Security, right? Now, again, I don't know if this is true. I don't think Elon Musk posts a lot of stuff that's not true. I know he posts some stuff that's not true. He's human. Okay, sure. I get that part. But here are the age brackets for people collecting Social Security. I'm not going to start at the top because it starts at 0 through 9. I'm not going to cover that. But let's just start with age 60 to 69. You would expect some people to be in that age range, and there's plenty. It goes in 10-year increments, 0 to 9, 10 to 19. I'm going to skip all the ones up to 59 years old because those are presumably people who are injured or disabled or whatever, right? But you would start expecting people to collect Social Security in their 60s. So there's 46,400,000 roughly people collecting Social Security between ages 60 and 69. Between 70 and 79, there's only 33,400,000. So it drops 11 million or so, or 13 million. 80 to 89, there's 15,100,000 people. 90 to 99, another big drop, 6 million people roughly. 100 to 109, 4,700,000. 110 to 119, 3,600,000. 120 to 129, 3.5 million. 130 to 139, it goes up now to almost 4 million, 3.96 million. 140 to 149, a little bit of a drop back down to 3.5 million, but still more than 120 to 129. Ages 150 to 159, 1.3 million people collecting Social Security. Ages 160 to 169, 121,000. Now we start dropping down at age 169. Something catastrophic happens, and people start dying at that age. Apparently,
start dying at 170 years old.
There must be some kind of virus out there that gets people when they hit 169 years old.
All those people.
Because it drops from 121,000 in the 160 to 169 age range to only 6,000 in the 170 to 179 range. 695 people collecting it between ages 180 to 189. 448 from 190 to 199. It goes back up again. Ages 200 to 209, 879. 210 to 219, 866, and it takes a big jump from 220 to 229. It's over 1,000, and there's one person between the ages of 240 and 249, and there's one person also between the ages of 360 and 369 collecting Social Security.
This is your government at work for you. This is your government, your ability to.
I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous that it's comical. It's also sad that this is how incapable the bureaucracy is, but man, is that maddening. I mean, that is insane. So just it's just so the waste that is going on there is just incredible, or fraud, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I mean, the amount. I mean, there wasn't. When was Social Security implemented? It was like in the
1932, 33, somewhere in there.
Yeah, in the middle 30s or something like that. So the fact that there's anybody that, I mean, it's just it's hard to know what to say about something that completely wasteful and completely wrong. Well, and the current target of DOGE is the IRS. And, so I'm a computer guy, I'm a tech guy. They're talking about how one of the difficult problems they have at the IRS is that a lot of their systems are still running on 1960s era software, essentially.
Is that, I heard that. That's crazy.
Yeah, 1960s era software.
If you look at a picture of a, what is it? What's the standard? I can't remember if it's a 5 meg. Forgive me, Dave. I'm not a tech guy, but there's a picture out there of a 5 megabyte or 5 gigabyte
hard disk.
Yeah, hard disk. Yeah, and it's like the size of an elevator.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then now you get 2 terabytes on a little tiny S disk or whatever they're called, little tiny things. You get 2 terabytes on that, which is I don't know how many thousands of times. But anyhow, can you imagine that big elevator size computer running our tax system? That's awesome.
It's unbelievable. I mean, even the level that in the previous story, the level of inefficiency there, and the level. I mean, this is how we collect money for the largest entity that's ever existed in the history of Earth. It's theoretically the most powerful, entity. It's the most powerful collection agency in the history of Earth, and this is how they do things. And this is how our retirement system in the United States works. So, the people that are up in arms about all the things that DOGE is doing, how can they not look at these things? I mean, how can the cognitive dissonance would have to be so intensely overwhelming to look at those numbers about Social Security. How many people? The oldest person in the world lives in Brazil and is 116 years old. So if you look at and say,
hold it, the oldest known person, Dave. You don't know that there's not.
Well, there could be
25 million people well over that age in our own ultra healthy country.
Sure, there's some Civil War survivors that are just holding out for the South to come back. They're still there, and folks that are, maybe some leftover British soldiers that have not given
I
up
mean,
on.
John Tyler has a grandson still living. And that
Well,
is true, by the way. That
and
is
Keith
true because
Richards,
he had a child
Keith
when he was like
Richards is still
70
alive.
something. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I've seen all those pictures of Keith Richards, with to survive the Black Plague back in the day. So,
but he's British, so I don't know if that counts.
yeah, probably doesn't count. So yeah, the whole the breaking loose. This is the thing that's been interesting to me about all these things that Elon and company have been discovering, and that is, and we've all known, and I don't think there's anybody left, right, center who would say that the federal government is an efficient user of money. I don't.
No.
I don't think that exists, and so we've known that there's been waste, fraud, and abuse. But the numbers that are being shared and the systems that are being uncovered that that are staggeringly worse than, I mean, I'm pretty cynical about it, but I had no clue about some of these things that are just undeniable. I mean, they're not conspiracies, they're just undeniable, insane amounts of money being wasted for not just poorly spent, but literally wasted. It
Yeah.
just boggles the imagination.
Well, and here we are in February 2025. Imagine what this is going to look like a year from now if they keep
Yeah,
going. Like they have not even gotten to the big stuff. They've not even
right,
gotten to Medicare, Medicaid, Social
right.
Security. Well, they are getting the Social Security. I take that back. But Medicare, Medicaid, and the Pentagon, they
Yeah,
have not
oh
even
my
gotten to the
goodness, yeah.
big three yet.
Well, yeah, as soon as well, the biggest chunk of our budget are the entitlement programs. If what would it take to balance the federal budget? It's not really going to take, honestly, that much to.
I think it's like a $2 trillion deficit we have. Isn't that about right?
Yeah,
Isn't that
I
about
think,
what we have every
yeah,
year? About 2 trillion.
yeah, in terms of the amount, but how much do we spend every year? Then, so if you look at what we spend and what the percentages of GDP and the amount that it would take to save that, if they continue on the same way that they are, and if they find those same levels, those same percentages in the entitlement programs of money being just, blown out into the ether, but nobody knowing where it went, it wouldn't surprise me if they could get to a place where they could balance a budget. I mean, it just wouldn't surprise me.
Well, what is always the reason we have as any government, not just ours, the reason that they have to take away our rights and to spend money, it's always about
Crisis.
safety,
Yeah, it's
right?
crisis. Yeah.
So yeah. So if we're finding in USAID the levels of waste, fraud, and abuse we found there, when on the scale of like what makes us safe, that is minuscule compared to Social Security and the Pentagon for
Yeah,
crying out
right.
loud.
Right.
I've heard numbers as high as there's I heard a number the other day, and I don't know what the time frame was. It might have been 10 years, it might have been a year. I don't know what it was, but that the Pentagon has $35 trillion in unaccounted for spending. Now, again, I don't know how valid that is. I don't
Yeah.
know it, but can you imagine a year from now if you and I are sitting here doing this and we're talking about $35 trillion, even if it's over a
Yeah.
10-year period,
Right.
$35 trillion in this style of wasteful spending, and
Right.
where you would have to expect to see more in the Pentagon and Medicare, Medicaid
Yeah.
than USAID. I mean,
Oh yeah.
because the justification is safety
Yes,
and
exactly.
like military safety and health safety. Like
Yeah.
if that is always the premise for how we just I would consider sometimes recklessly spending money,
Yeah.
that those would be the areas you'd expect to see the most, I would think.
And what happens when that is revealed? I mean, so if you see this amount of pushback, I mean, people rioting outside of USAID and, with their little chants and all that kind of stuff. You see this amount of pushback for relatively small amounts, only in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, penny any little, cash here and there, pocket change. If you see this amount of pushback for that, what happens when you find a trillion, 2 trillion, 3 trillion? Well, that's someplace. That's somewhere. And
Yeah.
whoever has been getting that, it's they're not going to go quietly into that dark night of poverty. That's going to be
No,
that's
I think
catastrophic.
if I had to put on my prognostication hat, I think some of the things that they're uncovering so far is the money goes somewhere, but we can't trace where it goes because the line item in the check register, so to speak, is blank, or the memo section of the check register is blank. Like it goes to a place, but we don't know why, and we don't really know what happens to it after that. And that I could see a world where that money just kind of gets lost after that without. I mean, the kind of subpoena, the volume of subpoenas you would have to get to like audit people's checking. I think that might be unmanageable even for a government like our size. But I think when the exposure continues to get involved bigger numbers, people are going to start wondering who got it. I think that is inevitable. People are going to wonder who got it. And when the answer comes back and even as transparent as, again, I'm not saying everything they're doing is perfect. I think they're generally doing a pretty good job of exposing this stuff. Plenty of people are going to think that they're not. I accept that. That's fine. You can have your own opinions about that. But I think they're doing a reasonably good job of being transparent about what they're finding and acknowledging, like they said, we sent $50 million to Gaza and we didn't. We sent to Mozambique and oh, yep, we got that wrong. You're right. But it's still $50 million.
Still $50 million for condoms,
yeah. As they're trying to be I do believe they're trying to be transparent. I know plenty of people won't agree with that, but I think that generally speaking, they're being transparent about that. At some point when they have to say this money is gone and we don't know where it went, I do, and we're talking, dollars in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. I do think there's going to be some unrest about, because people are paying $9 for a dozen eggs. They are paying $4 a gallon for fuel. They are paying, I think homeowners insurance or car insurance has gone up like 40% this year, and on top of the 25% or so last year. Like these are debilitating in some cases, staggering increase in costs. And wages have not kept up anywhere near. Wages have rose a lot, but not on that order. I think people are going to be wondering, like, somebody somewhere got this money in their personal checking account at some point. Now, we understand it went through a series of corporations and foundations and whatever, but somebody somewhere got this in their personal checking account. And when they have to say we don't know who got it, man, I think we could be in for some trouble then.
Well, especially if we trace it offshore, that's going to be huge too. If you're, it's bad enough if you trace it to, fat cats, so to speak, in the United States, just power brokers and people like that. But even more because the whole USAID thing has been stuff that we've sent, money for a transgender plane in Colombia or something like that, just crazy stuff. But if we find that we send billions or trillions to other governments that don't share our values at all, they'll be held to pay on that front too. I think it's across the board.
Yeah, I wonder. We're getting in kind of a speculative conversation, which is not the purpose of this. But I do wonder, if you just look at like the process in which the money flows, right? So a lawmaker is elected, and they approve money to go to USAID.
Right.
USAID then hires, spends money through a organization. And I don't know enough about this to know if they're corporations or foundations, or I don't know the structure of them. I don't know how that works. But USAID pays a contractor of some sort to do a thing, and that contractor has people in prestigious positions, the president, the CEO, the board, the whatever, who are making, several $100,000, right? And then they subcontract out to another foundation or organization who also has people making these high salaries.
Yeah.
But those organizations, whether they be corporations or foundations or whatever, hire lobbyists.
Sure.
And those lobbyists then get paid a whole bunch of money to go back to DC to lobby the lawmakers to send more money to USAID. Right. Now that's one little tiny circle in this whole, what do you call it? What do you call the Lazarus? What was the word you used for it? The labyrinth. Yeah, labyrinth. So that's one small circle in this huge labyrinth of probably hundreds or thousands of circles like that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, are people going to be more pissed about the people in DC kind of having this circular fundraising for themselves, or like you're saying, we're sending it to, places that send people here to do terroristic kind of things and harm us and like hold people hostage and so I don't know. I do think there's going to be a reckoning though as this continues to unfold.
I suspect there'll be no lack of people being mad about many different tracks. I suspect that's going to be. And the other thing that occurs to me as we're talking about this is what what systems and industries are going to be disrupted at the lack of flow of funds that was coming from the federal government that's not coming from the federal government anymore. There could be some economic consequences for the entire country if
Yeah.
that flow, is interrupted as well. So
Well, there's already, I mean, the again, I don't know, I never know if any of this stuff is true, but they're the supposedly based on a couple of things I saw on X, the number of houses for sale, $1 million plus houses for sale in the DC area has gone up substantially in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
So even simple things like the housing market could be supported in part by this kind of thing. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. So back to what we were talking about earlier, like the cognitive dissonance, and you're the approved group who we are. It's okay to lash out at you and call you names and say you're bad people because of how you look and your immutable characteristics.
Right.
We started this episode talking about how that is like prevalent in our culture right now.
Right.
So I wonder though, where is the breaking point? Because as these dollars get exposed and the dollars get bigger and people start connecting the dots and they get more, like I've already seen some computer simulations of how they show the money leaving USAID, going to the foundation, going to the corporation, going to the contractor. Yeah. Like they have a AI virtual map of that. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but as that gets more sophisticated, it becomes more clear like how the process actually works. People will stop having the cognitive dissidence. And if there are any consequences, going back to what our friend Yuri Brezhnev said about how people will think that the socialism and communism is the way to go until they're kicked in their bottom, I think is what he said, in the camp, then they realize, oh, this is actually bad. But I imagine that also applies if you go to jail. I imagine that also applies if you lose your house and your status. I imagine that also applies in other non-literal circumstances.
Yeah, I suspect so. And I suspect that I think it'll be one of those tipping point situations where you can't really predict when and how and what will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. But it would seem that there would be significant economic upheaval. It would seem also that there would be significant changes in our legal structure, because if people see that, they're like, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? How can we change things around? Now that brings with it both positive and negative potentials. I mean, so it does bring with it the potential of, well, we need to centralize more power in certain institutions to prevent that from happening. So it's by no means, if you look at like South America is a great example of a place where people have readily identified evil being done and have taken dramatic action to end the evil, only end up with a worse dictator than the one they just kicked out. So the challenge I think that faces us in this kind of situation is there will be both the disgust as a result of that, and you see that starting now, and there will also be the calls for some change to the system to prevent it from happening again, but which then brings with it the risk of too much power in a certain place. And I don't know what place that is, but I'm just saying that there's risks to that.
Well, and also, I mean, we can't even count the number of laws we have on the books today.
Yeah.
Adding more laws, I think there's got to be a point where that can't be the solution anymore, because there's just so many contradictory laws and such. To live an everyday life, you would have to like have AI with you to tell you what you can do and what you can't do. There's got to be a threshold where just adding more laws can't be the solution anymore. And Neil Howe talks about this in The Fourth Turning Is Here, and I've heard him talk about it on podcasts. Like historically, as we've gone through these fourth turnings and these crisis periods, a solution that we've chosen has been to make the government bigger.
Yeah.
But in this case, he says specifically that is not an option anymore. The government's already too big. Part of the process this time has to be shrinking the government, which I would imagine has to include shrinking the number of laws. But I don't know. But I don't know how you would privatize some of that stuff if you didn't. But I still think like my gut tells me like you can't. There's a certain point where you can't add more laws to fix
Yeah.
things because you have too many. Unless you have a process where for every law you add, you take 3 off the books. That would work. I would be all in favor of that.
I mean,
And I think AI would be a great tool to identify those contradictory laws so we can identify the ones to take off.
that is logical. I don't always depend on human beings and society to be logical in their addressing of things. It is logical. The other possibility of that is that I think I mentioned last week that I have a sense that this turning that we're in and what's going to come out of it could very well result in American empire. So in that situation, you could potentially end up with fewer laws, with power centralized in a smaller number of people, maybe not an emperor per se, but a smaller number of people with who are charged as the ministers of finance that then prevent this from happening in the future. So there's one law, there's one law for every 1,000 we had before, but it's centralized by power in other people. And that's one of the things I'm talking about with in terms of a danger in solving this problem. We might solve this problem with an institution that makes the problem in Kenny G's time perhaps worse. It could solve it in our time as we come out of the crisis era, but in Kenny G's
Well, that's how it always goes. We solve the immediate problems, but as they become those institutions and processes and laws and systems over time become corrupted and band-aided and abused and whatever, they become problematic for the next crisis era, which is what the very institutions we put in place after World War II, like the CIA, arguably are causing some of the things we have now, which brings up an interesting point, talking about this kind of centralization of power. One of the things that I think is inevitable is we're going to be discovering some of these things that have been very, very well kept secrets as far as intelligence and the military and things like that. And we have what I think that's called the Gang of Eight, the 8 senators who sit on the Intelligence Committee, and then there's a version in the House. But they've become more vocal about there's just things that they can't see, or they're only willing to push so hard out of fear of being kiddie porn being put on their computers or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
I think that is going to that I don't see any way that isn't addressed and fixed here. And it could be adding 15 more people to that committee and giving them true oversight and true, which again, the more people you add into that world, the less secret things are, which could create national security issue. Like I think I think one of the things that is interesting in this period right now for Kenny G to know is guys like you and I will sit here and talk about, well, if you do this solution, there's this consequence. And you got to look out for that. And ultimately we're humans and there's no solution for this. Like we just do the best we can as we move through history, doing the best we can, making flawed decisions because we're human and we make flawed decisions. Right. Other people in our era don't do that. They say, this is absolutely the way it will be, and this is absolutely the way it has to be to work. And of course it's going to work this way. And I think that's a big part of why we have so many disagreements.
It absolutely is why we have so many disagreements, because some people believe, well, and what you just described is sort of the utopian vision. And I think the utopian vision always ends with bloodshed because people, because humans are humans and some people aren't going to go along. And if the utopian vision says, here is perfection, and perfection at any cost means you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. So, sorry, Brian and Dave, are those eggs that got to be broken.
Or you have your vision of what utopia is and I have mine, and we can't compromise and come to terms. So we just have to,
and then there's war.
the sword has to decide who's right.
Exactly.
And history is full of plenty of emperors and kings who come to power in that way who didn't have the best intentions.
Oh yeah. Well, and even if they do have the best intentions, then the good and what's the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So you believe your ideas are the right ideas, and this is again why I small government is better because it can't do too much damage if you're wrong,
right?
And this is why there's a danger in if we solve these problems through centralized authority, which we could very well, then there's danger that more danger than there is in a dysfunctional government. So right now, you look at our government, you look at the systems and say, man, it's so broken. But if it's so broken, then it can do harm, but maybe not as much harm as a system that's perfectly functional that gets corrupted. So either way, you end up in a scenario, and that's again why why does the fourth turning happen? Why are there the saeculum? Why are there the generations? This is the way it's designed. It's just designed this way. You can say that God designed it this way. That's how I would come down. But it's because it's self-correcting. Because when you get the new system into place, you have to recognize up front. And this is the thing I think to say to Kenny G too, is like the people in our era that after World War II honestly designed a system where they thought that they were going to prevent the war from happening again. There's going to be World War III. Now, the Soviet Union was a constant kind of worry there, but they designed a system that they honestly believed was going to advance humanity, and it did, and we are more advanced than we are now. But Kenny G has got to know that whatever we put into place, or our children or grandchildren put into place after the crisis era happens now, will inevitably succumb to the second law of thermodynamics. It will decay in entropy because that's what everything does in the universe. And it is part of the self-correction process. So don't worry, Kenny G. If you survive it, you'll come out the other end better off in a system that we couldn't even possibly recognize, but it'll be better.
Yeah, well, I was just listening to Mike Benz on the guy who we spent a whole episode dissecting his entire interview. He was talking about like one of the CIA's first quote unquote wins was changing the election in Italy after World War II. Oh, yeah. They had a kind of a more of a capitalistic West, a guy who thought favorably like Western values, and running against a guy who was very much in alignment with the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And if not for our intervention in Italy's elections, which is, I'm laughing because starting in 2016, all this fervor about foreign intervention in our elections, but we're a bit hypocritical about that, right?
Oh, of course we are.
It's okay for us, but not for them. If not for our intervention in the Italian election post World War II, the communist guy was well out in front of that election, and so immediately, like their very first thing was a win. And so that substantiated that, hey, we're on the right track here. So putting yourself in their shoes, you can see how we start down this path. And then Truman, of course, giving his speech on worrying about the military industrial complex, and like he could foresee how it could go wrong, but they still were doing the best they could in the circumstance they were in, giving the tools available to them. Right. And we will do the same thing. We will do the best we can based on where we're at with the tools we have available to us. But that will not likely be suitable beyond 4 generations.
Right. It will absolutely not, because it never has been and probably never will be, because that's, again, just back to the immutable nature of human nature. We will revert. So you look at those two conflicting sentiments. The CIA was and is a very utilitarian organization, and you look at the high-minded ideals of the founders and of those of us that don't work in the bowels of the machine. And at some point, some people, you watch all the spy shows, somebody's got to do the dirty work. Somebody's got to do the immoral stuff to support the morality. Well, this is the story of humanity. And, you want to believe that you never have to resort to utilitarian means, but sometimes that does happen. So it's a tough balance.
Well, it's funny you talk about the dirty work. That same Mike Benz was just on Joe Rogan's podcast about a week ago. And for people listening in 2025, I highly recommend it. It's 3 hours long, but it's very, very informative. And one of the things he talks about is the way it works is the CIA, for everything that they do that's a covert operation, they have to submit something to the president. The president has to personally sign off that this is okay. USAID does not have that rule. So things that are too dirty for the CIA, that they say there's no way the president's going to sign off on that, we just ship it over to USAID and they take care of it.
Interesting.
And so there's a loophole in the system we created. So not only is the system not working for us, but we're not even following the system we put in place back in 1947 or 49 or whenever the CIA was created.
Right.
We're not even following that system anymore. We've made quote unquote improvements to our process on how this works, and we've created these loopholes, which is when I talk about things getting like bastardized, this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's not operating in the way it was designed to operate. We've altered it along the way, thus creating more problems. And a quick thought on what you were saying about, like, from a religious perspective. Now, I'm not a theologian, as you know, but I do wonder sometimes, the thought of an 85-year-old person on their deathbed laying there thinking, man, I nailed it. I did everything right in life. I didn't make any mistakes. And humanity across the board, we tend to have our shit together. Like I think that's kind of a ludicrous idea.
It is. Yeah.
So if you were a grand designer, a sentient being creating this, wouldn't that be the lesson you would want people to learn in this life? Is that the things that we left to our own devices, we will not make good decisions by and large, and maybe that's part of the grand scheme of things. I don't know.
Well, I mean, that's, I can claim to a certain extent to be a theologian because I got some training there, but yeah, that is essentially the message. Is like, you guys try it your way and see how it works out. If it doesn't work out,
how's that working for you?
That's kind of the message of the Garden of Eden and kind of the message of the entire scripture. And that's, I think the message that gives the 85-year-old some hope is like, yeah, I tried it my way. I did the Frank Sinatra thing, but I'm glad there's something more than just my way, because it didn't work out as well as I thought.
And I did the best I could, given the circumstances I was in and the tools available to me.
Yep.
Looking back, I did a lot of things wrong.
Yeah, exactly right.
I think that ultimately, not everyone, because some people die when they're 17 or whatever, so they wouldn't have that opportunity to come to that conclusion. But I think that people who live through that one long seculum, the 80 to 100 years, I think they do come to that conclusion. And most of us, I would say, way earlier than that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, this cohort that we see now, and I don't mean this in a political way, both sides of the aisle have this for sure.
Yeah.
But there's this cohort of our population that just will not accept that.
Yeah.
What they know is absolutely best, and of course this is the way it should be, and there's no question in my mind. And I just don't have the capacity to think like that, because history in my own life tell me that is not true.
Well, I think people will. I think another part of human nature for a lot of folks is when you invest your entire life in a system of thinking, in a belief system, and you put everything into it, you don't want to get to 60, 70, 89 years old and realize, crap, I made the wrong choice when I was 20 and I just wasted my entire life. I think that's kind of a hard thing for people to accept. Now, if you and then this is again on religion. If you're a religious person in your 20s and you realize that, well, I'm not perfect, only God's perfect, and I'm going to make mistakes along the way, and that's going to happen, then you don't necessarily have to look back and say, well, yeah, I mean, I don't think any self-aware person reaches, at least I'm 61. You don't reach 61 and have self-awareness and think I did it all right. Nobody is self-aware. It doesn't. Only somebody who is totally self-absorbed and can possibly say that. But then, it becomes okay to say, I wasn't meant to do everything right, because this is, again, the human equation. And I tried to do it right, but, sometimes I fail.
Right. Well, the exposure is going to lead to untold volumes of things for you and I to talk about. I'm sure of that.
Indeed.
And I think there's going to be plenty of things that do make the history books for Kenny G to look back on and say, what a bunch of dummies. How could you do that? How could you?
Kenny G? Back at
you,
future buddy.
Yeah, no kidding, right? We all have our cross to bear, so to speak, right? Well, as Dave mentioned in the opening, if you think there's something we got right, or you think there's something we're completely off the mark on, we'd like to hear about it. You can go to unsilentpodcast.com, and you can go to Rumble. There's a great comment section there. Again, we're trying to explain to future generation what it's like to live in this moment and talk about all the things that won't make the history books. And with that, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.